The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the weathered porch of Blackwater Creek Ranch. October wind, carrying the scent of dying sage and distant rain, whispered through the cottonwoods that had stood sentinel over this land for longer than most men's memories. Jackson Thornton sat in his grandfather's rocking chair, the same chair that had borne witness to 3 generations of hard decisions and harder truths. At 85, his hands bore the topography of a life lived outdoors, each scar a story, each callus a chapter in a book that was nearing its final pages. Beside him stood Lily Thornton Redwing, 54 years of grace and strength, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of 2 worlds reconciled. She had driven up from Albuquerque that morning with her granddaughter Emma, a bright-eyed 12-year-old whose curiosity burned with the same intensity Jack remembered in her grandmother at that age. Emma had been exploring the old ranch house, and she emerged now onto the porch, holding something that made the old man's breath catch in his throat. "Grandpa Jack," Emma said, her young voice cutting through the afternoon quiet like a bell. "I found this in your study. What is it?" In her hands she held an Apache dream catcher, its sinew web still strong despite decades of hanging in the New Mexico air. Tiny turquoise stones the color of summer sky were woven into the pattern. Jack reached for it with trembling fingers, and the moment his skin touched the worn leather frame 47 years fell away like autumn leaves. "That," he said, his voice rough with memory and emotion, "belonged to your great-grandmother Ayanna. She made it the winter after we met, when this ranch became more than just my land. It became our home." Emma settled onto the porch steps, her young face upturned with interest. Lily moved to stand behind her father's chair, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. She knew this story had lived parts of it, but she also knew that her father needed to tell it again, perhaps for the last time, to pass the torch of memory to another generation. "Tell me, Grandpa," Emma said, "how did you meet great-grandma Ayanna?" Jack closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years and the wisdom earned through fire and blood and redemption. "Child, some stories aren't meant to be forgotten. Some promises outlive the men who make them. This here's about a promise I made 47 years ago, when the world was wilder and a man's word was all the law that mattered. It's about how I learned that the measure of a man isn't in the wars he's fought or the enemies he's killed. It's in the promises he keeps when keeping them costs him everything." The old man's eyes drifted closed, and the present faded into memory sharp and vivid as the day it happened. The same porch, the same ranch. But 47 years earlier, when the paint was fresher, and the man who stood there was harder, younger, carrying different scars. June of 1914, and the world was on the edge of a war that would change everything, though Jackson Thornton didn't know that yet. What he did know was that 3 riders were approaching his property line, and their posture in the saddle told him they weren't bringing good news. Jack was 38 that summer, lean and weathered as the land itself. He'd bought Blackwater Creek Ranch 9 years prior with money saved from his time as an Army scout, back when tracking Apache raiders had been his profession and his curse. The cavalry boots he'd worn then gathered dust in a closet now. These days, he wore the boots of a rancher, and he'd convinced himself that chapter of his life was closed. The past he'd learned had other ideas about staying buried. He watched the riders close the distance, one hand resting easy on the weathered oak porch railing, the other hovering near the Colt single-action revolver at his hip. Old habits die hard, and some habits keep you alive. The afternoon sun caught on something metallic among the approaching trio, a glint of brass that made Jack's jaw tighten. Badge. Which meant law, or at least men pretending at it. The lead rider was a man Jack recognized with the kind of recognition that sits bitter in the gut. Silas Crow, former Texas Ranger, current bounty hunter, and a man whose relationship with justice had always been more about profit than principle. Crow sat his horse like a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it, his face weathered to leather eyes, hard as flint. The two men flanking him were cut from the same cloth hired guns, trying to legitimize themselves with deputy badges that carried about as much authority as a whiskey-soaked promise. "That's far enough," Jack called out when they reached the 50-yard mark, his voice carrying clear across the distance. Not hostile, not yet, but with the kind of edge that made smart men think twice. Crow reined in his mount, a gesture that the others followed. A yellow smile split his weathered face, showing teeth stained from years of tobacco. "Jack Thornton," Crow said, his voice carrying the rough edges of too many nights sleeping rough and too many days riding hard. "Been a while since I saw you. Heard you'd gone respectable raising cattle instead of chasing Indians?" "Times change," Jack replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Most men change with them." "Some do," Crow agreed, shifting in his saddle. "Others just find new ways to make old money. We're tracking some Apache that passed through these parts. You seen any?" The question hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Jack had indeed seen signs the day before, fresh tracks heading north toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the kind of tracks that spoke of people moving fast and scared. He'd noted them, filed the information away, and deliberately chosen not to follow up. His tracking days were done. "Haven't seen anything but dust and cattle for weeks." Jack said, the lie coming easy because it was for a good cause. "What's your interest in Apache thought? We were past all that trouble." Crow's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "Army's offering $500 for a certain Apache woman, dead or alive. She's wanted for theft of government property. Got herself a child with her, too." $500. More money than most men saw in a year, and Crow was the kind of man who'd burn down a church for half that. Jack felt his stomach tighten, though his face remained impassive. "500's a lot of money for theft," he observed. "Must be something pretty valuable she took." "That's government business," Crow said, the smile fading. "I'm just here collecting. You sure you haven't seen anything? Sure as I'm standing here." Crow studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that measured and calculated and came to conclusions. Whatever he saw in Jack's face, he seemed to accept it, or at least he seemed to accept that pushing harder would get him nowhere. "Well then," Crow said, gathering his reins, "we'll be on our way. But Jack, word to the wise. Times may be changing, but law's still law. Man who helps fugitives becomes a fugitive himself. You remember that should your memory suddenly improve." "I'll keep that in mind," Jack said. He watched them ride north, dust rising in their wake like smoke from a dying fire. Only when they disappeared over the rise did Jack allow himself to move his hand, finally dropping from the proximity of his gun. The afternoon had gone quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath, waiting for something to break. Jack descended the porch steps and made his way toward the barn, following an instinct he couldn't quite name. The main barn doors stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual, but there was something in the quality of the stillness that made his hand drift back toward his gun. He'd learned in his Army days to trust the feeling when something wasn't right, even when he couldn't articulate what that something was. The barn interior was dim and cool, hay-scented and familiar. Dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light that filtered through gaps in the weathered boards. Jack's eyes took a moment to adjust, and in that moment he heard it. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, but Jack had spent too many years listening for the sounds of life in places that seemed empty. Someone was here trying very hard to be silent and not quite succeeding. He moved deeper into the barn, his boots quiet on the packed earth floor. The sound came again, a tiny indrawn breath from the direction of the hayloft. Jack climbed the ladder slowly, each rung creaking under his weight despite his care. At the top he paused, letting his eyes fully adjust to the deeper shadows. There, half buried in the loose hay, he saw her. A child no more than 7 years old, Apache by the look of her, clutching a doeskin pouch to her chest, like it was the most precious thing in the world. Her dark eyes were huge, in her thin face terror and exhaustion warring for dominance. Her left shoulder showed a makeshift bandage, crude but effective, wrapped over what looked like a bullet graze. Jack stopped moving, holding himself very still. He'd gentled enough wild horses in his time to know how to approach something small and scared and ready to bolt. "Easy now, little one," he said, his voice pitched low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child didn't speak, just watched him with wide, fearful eyes. Jack could see her trembling, her fingers white-knuckled around the leather bundle. Slowly telegraphing every movement, he sat down on the hay-strewn floor of the loft, making himself smaller, less threatening. "You hurt?" he asked, nodding toward her shoulder. "Let me take a look at that." Still no response, but her eyes tracked his every movement as he pulled a canteen from his belt and held it out to her. Water was a universal language, and thirst trumped fear more often than not. After a long moment, hunger and thirst won out over caution. The child snatched the canteen, drinking desperately while keeping her eyes locked on him. While she drank, Jack studied her. The bullet graze on her shoulder was a clean wound already starting to heal, but the crude bandage needed changing. More concerning was her overall condition. She was thin, too thin, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd gone days without proper food or rest. Her buckskin dress was dusty and torn in places, but remarkably free of blood. She'd been running, that much was clear, and she'd been running hard. "What's your name, little one?" Jack asked softly, though he suspected she didn't speak English. "Where's your mama?" At the word mama, something shifted in the child's face. She pointed west toward the distant blue outline of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and spoke a single word in Apache. "Shima," mother. Jack didn't speak much Apache, but he'd picked up enough in his years of tracking to know that word. His heart sank. Those mountains were 40 miles of rough country, and if this child's mother was out there, she was either looking desperately for her daughter or past the point of looking for anything. A sound from outside the barn made both of them freeze, hoofbeats approaching at an easy trot. Jack recognized the rhythm even before he heard the familiar voice calling out. "Jack, you in there? Got news from town?" Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell, one of the few men in New Mexico territory that Jack counted as a true friend. They'd served together in Cuba back in '98 during the Spanish-American War, had saved each other's lives more than once in those fever-ridden jungles. Ben had taken a bullet in the leg at San Juan Hill, left him with a limp that grew more pronounced as the years wore on, but it hadn't slowed his determination to do right by the law he served. Jack held a finger to his lips, a universal gesture that the child seemed to understand. Her eyes went, if possible, even wider, but she stayed silent. Jack climbed down from the loft, brushing hay from his clothes, and stepped out to meet Ben before the sheriff could come inside and see what Jack was hiding. Ben sat his horse in the barnyard, a solid man gone a bit thick in the middle, as men in their 40s often do. His badge caught the afternoon sun, a star of authority that Ben wore with more honor than most. He was dressed for riding, his coat dusty from the trail, and his face carried an expression Jack knew well. It was Ben's "I've got bad news, and I hate delivering it" face. "Afternoon, Ben," Jack said, closing the barn door behind him. "What brings you out from town?" Ben dismounted, moving careful with his bad leg, and tied his horse to the hitching post. He took off his hat, running fingers through hair that had gone more gray than brown since the last time Jack had really looked. "Got word from the territorial office," Ben said, his voice heavy. "There's been trouble up in the Sangre de Cristo range. Apache trouble, they're calling it, though I suspect it's more complicated than that." Jack felt his gut tighten, but kept his face neutral. "What kind of trouble?" Ben looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from his good leg to his bad one and back again. "Official report says a band of renegade Apache attacked some government surveyors 3 days ago, killed 2 men, wounded 3 more. Army's been authorized to conduct pacification operations in response." Pacification operations. The word sat bitter on Jack's tongue. He'd heard those words before in the Philippines back in '02, right before he'd watched an entire village burn to the ground because someone in command decided that collective punishment was easier than actual justice. "Who's running this pacification?" Jack asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer. "Bureau of Indian Affairs agent named Harrison Blackwood," Ben said, and Jack felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "You know him. Know him." Jack's hand clenched involuntarily, remembering other fires, other screams, other times when Harrison Blackwood had decided that the fastest path to mission accomplished ran straight through the bodies of anyone who got in his way. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice gone flat and hard. "I know him. Philippines campaign '02. He was a captain then, liked to solve problems with fire and bullets. Didn't much care if those problems were armed combatants or farmers who happened to be in the wrong place." Ben's expression went grim. "That tracks with what I've been hearing. Jack, this ain't a pacification. It's a land grab. That territory up in the Sangres has turquoise deposits, valuable ones. And conveniently, there's this small band of Apache living there under some old treaty from back in '86 that most folks have forgotten about." "But Blackwood hasn't forgotten," Jack said. It wasn't a question. "Blackwood hasn't forgotten," Ben confirmed, "and neither have the mining interests that are paying him. Word is they want those Apache relocated so they can start extracting that turquoise. Legal way would take years of court battles. Blackwood's way is a lot faster." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken knowledge heavy between them. Ben had been with Jack in the Philippines, had seen what happened when men like Blackwood were given authority and no oversight. They both knew what pacification meant when Blackwood was running the show. "How many Apache in this band?" Jack asked. "Reports vary, anywhere from 30 to 50 people, mostly families, some elderly children. Not exactly what I'd call a military threat, but convenient to label as renegades." "Very convenient," Ben agreed. He studied Jack's face, and Jack could see his old friend doing the math, adding up the pieces. "Jack, if you've got one of those Apache hiding somewhere on this property, you need to know that Blackwood has legal authority, federal authority, and I can't protect you if you're harboring what the government considers fugitives." Jack held his friend's gaze steadily. "She's 7 years old, Ben. Got a bullet graze on her shoulder. Probably hasn't eaten properly in days. You telling me that's a renegade?" Ben's face showed the conflict playing out behind his eyes. The law he'd sworn to uphold versus the justice he believed in. It was a conflict Jack knew well, had wrestled with himself more than once. "I'm telling you that the law and justice aren't always the same thing," Ben said quietly, "and I'm telling you that Blackwood's men will be searching every ranch within 50 miles of those mountains. You've got maybe 2 days before they get here. Whatever you're planning to do, you better do it fast." "I appreciate the warning." "Jack," Ben said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history, "I know that look. I've seen it before, right before you do something noble and stupid. Don't make me choose between our friendship and my badge." "Wouldn't dream of it," Jack said, but they both knew he was lying, and they both knew that Ben knew it. After Ben left, riding back toward town, with the same troubled expression he'd arrived with, Jack stood in the barnyard watching the sun sink lower toward the western horizon. The shadows were getting long, the kind of light that made everything look either beautiful or ominous, depending on your state of mind. Jack's state of mind was leaning heavily toward ominous. He returned to the barn, climbed back up to the loft where the child still huddled in the hay, watching him with those enormous dark eyes. She'd finished the water in his canteen, the pouch once again pressed protectively against her chest. "All right, little one," Jack said gently. "We need to take care of that shoulder, and then we need to figure out what to do with you." He gathered supplies from his saddlebag, basic field medicine that any man who'd served in the army knew by heart. Whiskey for cleaning wounds, clean cloth for bandages, needle and thread for stitching if needed. The child watched him prepare but didn't bolt, which Jack took as a good sign. "This might sting," he warned, though he suspected she didn't understand the words. The tone seemed to get through, though, because she set her jaw in a way that reminded him of soldiers he'd known, men and women, both who'd faced pain with courage born of necessity. The wound was healing clean, no infection, which was a small mercy. It was a graze from a 30-40 Krag rifle, the kind the Army issued to its scouts and marksmen. Jack had seen enough bullet wounds to recognize the distinctive track it left. Some government man had shot at this child, had aimed for her, and thank God his aim had been just slightly off. The knowledge sat in Jack's chest like a stone. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, working as gently as he could while the child bit her lip to keep from crying out. When he'd finished and wrapped a fresh bandage around her thin shoulder, he sat back and studied her. "Where's your mama, child?" he asked again, knowing she couldn't answer in words, but hoping she might show him. The girl pointed west again, toward those distant mountains that were turning purple in the fading light. Then she did something unexpected. She opened the pouch she'd guarded so carefully and withdrew 2 items. The first was a crude doll made from corn husks and scraps of leather, the kind of toy a loving parent might make for a child with whatever materials were at hand. The second item made Jack's breath catch. It was a document folded carefully and sealed with wax that had been broken and resealed more than once. Jack could see official-looking stamps and signatures even from a distance. The girl held it out to him with trembling hands, and the trust implicit in that gesture hit Jack harder than he'd expected. He took the document carefully, unfolding it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. The paper was good quality, the kind that government offices used for official business. The text was written in careful script, dated August 15, 1886, and titled in bold letters that seemed to shout across the decades. Treaty of Blackwater Creek. Jack's hand started to shake as he read. It was a formal agreement between the territory of New Mexico and the Apache band led by Chief Takota, granting them 5,000 acres in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in perpetuity. Hunting rights, water rights, autonomy in their own affairs. Signed by Territorial Governor Edmund Ross himself, witnessed by multiple officials, legal and binding under federal law. Except the federal government had apparently decided to pretend this treaty didn't exist. The turquoise deposits made the land too valuable, and a piece of paper from 28 years ago was just an inconvenience to be swept aside. The document also included something else, a hand-drawn map, carefully detailed, showing the location of what the legend called a sacred turquoise mine. The mine that made this land so valuable that men were willing to kill for it. Jack looked up from the document to find the child watching him, her eyes asking a question she couldn't speak. The weight of that question, the responsibility it implied, settled onto his shoulders like a physical thing. He was being asked to help. He was being trusted. And if he said no, if he turned this child away, he'd have to live with that decision for the rest of his life. "All right," he said softly. "All right, little one. We'll find your mama, I promise." The child seemed to understand the tone, if not the words, because some of the terror left her eyes, replaced by something that might have been hope. Jack carefully refolded the treaty and handed it back to her. She returned it to the pouch, then reached for his hand with her small fingers. The touch of her hand in his, trusting and desperate and impossibly fragile, made something crack in the walls Jack had built around his heart. He led her down from the loft out of the barn and toward the ranch house as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and clear, and Jack found himself thinking about promises and the cost of keeping them. He settled the child in his own bed, covering her with the heavy quilt his late wife had made before the influenza took her 2 years back. The child was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow, exhaustion finally winning out over fear. Jack stood there watching her sleep, this tiny refugee from someone else's war, and felt the familiar weight of duty settling onto shoulders that had tried to shrug it off. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was full dark now, stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds, and visitors, at this hour, were rarely bringing good news. Jack checked his gun before opening the door, old habits asserting themselves. The figure on his porch was backlit by starlight, but Jack recognized her immediately, even in shadow. The way she moved, balanced and ready, spoke of someone who'd learned to fight for survival. She had a knife in her hand, the blade catching starlight, and her eyes held the kind of desperate determination that made people dangerous in all the ways that mattered. Before Jack could speak, before he could raise his hands in peace, she was on him. The attack came fast and fierce, all skill and fury and mother's terror. The knife slashed toward his throat, and Jack barely managed to deflect it, his cavalry training kicking in on pure instinct. They grappled in the doorway, neither willing to give ground, locked in a desperate struggle that was silent except for harsh breathing and the scuff of boots on wooden planks. She was strong, stronger than her slim frame suggested, and skilled in ways that spoke of hard-won knowledge. Jack fought defensively, trying not to hurt her, trying to subdue without causing damage. It was harder than fighting to kill, required more control. And he was losing ground when a small voice cut through the struggle like a knife through silk. Shima. The word, high and frightened and filled with recognition, froze both combatants. Jack looked over his attacker's shoulder to see the child standing in the bedroom doorway, her gaze bright with unshed tears in her pale face. The woman's head whipped around, and the change that came over her face was like sunrise breaking over a dark horizon. "Lily?" She breathed the single word carrying more emotion than Jack had heard in 1,000 speeches. She released Jack immediately, her knife clattering to the floor as she rushed to gather the child into her arms. What followed was a reunion that Jack felt privileged to witness and ashamed to watch, something so private and profound that it seemed wrong for strangers' eyes to see it. The woman held the child like she was the most precious thing in all creation, checking her for injuries with hands that shook, speaking in rapid Apache that Jack couldn't follow, but whose meaning was crystal clear. The child clung to her, crying in the way that children cry when they've been brave for too long and finally feel safe enough to fall apart. Jack stood back, giving them space, and took the opportunity to really look at the woman. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with the kind of beauty that came from strong bones and clear eyes rather than delicate features. Her long dark hair was dusty and tangled her clothes worn from hard travel, but she moved with a grace that spoke of someone who was comfortable in her own skin. There was intelligence in her eyes, and grief, and a determination that would burn through anyone who stood between her and her daughter. Finally, after long minutes of checking and rechecking that the child was truly whole and safe, the woman looked up at Jack. Her hand remained protectively on her daughter's shoulder, but her other hand went to the knife that still lay on the floor between them. Not threatening, not yet, but ready. "You saved her," she said, and Jack was surprised to hear clear, unaccented English. "Why, found her hiding in my barn," Jack replied, keeping his voice low and calm. "She had a bullet wound that needed tending. Couldn't exactly leave her there. But you could have turned her in. There is a bounty." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered in a tone that suggested she'd learned to expect the worst from people. "There is," Jack acknowledged. $500. That's a lot of money for a child's life. For most men, enough money. Her eyes studied him, measuring, calculating probabilities and risks. "You are not most men. I'm just a man who's done enough things he regrets. Didn't see any reason to add selling out a 7-year-old to that list." Something in the woman's posture relaxed slightly, though her hand stayed near the knife. She spoke again in Apache to the child, who answered in a high, rapid voice, gesturing toward Jack, and then touching her bandaged shoulder. Whatever the child said seemed to matter, because the woman's expression shifted again, suspicion giving way to something that might have been the beginning of trust. "I am Ayana," she said. "This is Lily, my daughter. You have my gratitude for protecting her. Jack Thornton, this is my ranch." He paused, then asked the question whose answer he dreaded. "What happened up in the mountains?" Ayana's face went still. A kind of stillness that spoke of terrible things carefully controlled. When she spoke again, Her voice was flat, drained of emotion, not because she didn't feel it, but because feeling it would break her. 4 days ago, they came at dawn. Government men soldiers, men with badges. They said we were living on federal land illegally, that we had to move to the reservation in Oklahoma. My husband, he was chief of our band. His name was Dakota. He tried to show them the treaty, the document that proved our right to that land. The yellow-haired colonel shot him, just shot him, no warning, no chance to speak. Then they killed the others, men, women, elders who could barely walk. They killed 17 people. She recited the numbers like she was reading from a ledger, but Jack could see the cost of that control in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hand shook slightly where it rested on Lily's shoulder. I was gathering medicine plants with Lily 1/2 mile from the camp. We heard the shots. I hid Lily in a hollow tree and told her to stay silent no matter what. Then I ran back. Her voice cracked just slightly. But I was too late. By the time I got there, they were all dead. The soldiers were searching the bodies looking for the treaty Dakota always carried. They wanted that document, wanted to destroy the proof of our rights. But you had it, Jack said, understanding. The copy in the pouch. Ayanna nodded. Dakota was careful. He kept the original hidden, gave me a copy for safekeeping. I ran. The colonel's men pursued me for 2 days through the mountains. We got separated in a storm. I've been searching for Lily for 3 days, following every trail, checking every hiding place. Her voice finally broke. I thought she was dead. I thought I'd lost her too. Jack felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold, controlled rage that he'd learned to channel in his years as a soldier. Blackwood. Of course it was Blackwood, the same man who'd ordered villages burned in the Philippines, who'd called the murder of civilians acceptable casualties in pursuit of military objectives. Jack had reported him, then had filed official complaints that had disappeared into the bureaucratic void, while Blackwood had been quietly transferred and promoted. And now he was here doing the same thing on American soil to American citizens who had the misfortune of standing between him and something valuable. This yellow-haired colonel, Jack said, though he already knew the answer. Harrison Blackwood. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. You know him, Jack said, the words bitter. Served with him in the Philippines. I was an Army scout back then. Saw him order the execution of an entire village because someone in that village might have been helping insurgents. I reported him. Nothing happened. He kept his commission, kept his authority, and I ended up resigning rather than follow any more of his orders. Then you understand, Ayanna said. This is not about renegade Apache. This is about greed and power and land that white men want. Jack nodded slowly. I understand. And I understand that treaty you're carrying is the only thing standing between your people and complete dispossession, which makes it dangerous to have and even more dangerous to try to use. I must take it to the territorial capital, to Santa Fe, file it with the federal land court, make it official record that cannot be ignored. Ayanna's voice carried determination that would have moved mountains if determination alone were enough. There must be justice for my people, for Dakota, for the 17 who died. Before Jack could respond, before he could tell her all the ways that plan was dangerous and maybe impossible, the night exploded with sound. A gunshot cracked across the darkness and glass shattered as one of Jack's windows took a bullet. Jack was moving before conscious thought, tackling both Ayanna and Lily to the floor as more bullets splintered the doorframe where they'd been standing moments before. United States Cavalry, a voice bellowed from the darkness beyond the ranch house. We have the house surrounded. Surrender the Apache woman and child. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized that voice. He'd heard it before, screaming orders across burning villages, demanding obedience with the kind of absolute certainty that only came from men who'd never been truly questioned. Harrison Blackwood had found them, and he'd brought enough men to make resistance seem like suicide. From his position on the floor, Jack could see through the broken window to the yard beyond. At least 20 men on horseback, all armed, all positioned to cover every exit from the house. They'd been professional about it, he had to give them that. military precision applied to civilian murder. Jack crawled to his gun cabinet, keeping low, and extracted his Winchester rifle and his Colt revolver. He checked the ammunition in both his hands, steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Behind him, Ayanna was whispering urgently to Lily in Apache, her voice calm, despite the terror in her eyes. "Thornton!" Blackwood's voice again, carrying that same mix of authority and arrogance that Jack remembered from a decade ago. "I know you're in there. Send out the woman and child, and we'll let you live." "This is private property." "Blackwood," Jack shouted back. "You've got no authority here without a warrant." Blackwood's laugh rang out across the yard, cold and cruel and utterly without humor. "You think I need a warrant, Thornton? I've got federal authority. These are fugitives from justice, and you're harboring them. You've got 1 minute to send them out, or we burn you out." Jack's mind raced, calculating angles and odds, and finding nothing good. 20 men against one, a woman and a child to protect. Multiple firing positions with overlapping fields of fire. If he tried to fight, they'd all die. If he surrendered Ayanna and Lily, they'd die anyway, just slower and more cruelly. Some choices weren't really choices at all. "There's a root cellar," Jack said urgently to Ayanna. "Trapdoor under that rug. Take Lily and get down there. There's a tunnel that comes out in the barn." "You will be killed," Ayanna stated flatly, and Jack admired the calm way she said it, like she was noting the weather. "Not planning on it," he said, though they both knew the odds. "But I didn't survive the Philippines and Cuba just to hand over a child to men like Blackwood. Now go." For a moment Ayanna hesitated, and Jack could see the war playing out in her eyes. The need to protect her daughter versus the knowledge that Jack was condemning himself to buy them time. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture so intimate and profound that it took Jack's breath away. She spoke in Apache words he didn't understand, but the meaning was clear in her eyes. Thank you. Honor. Respect. All the things that couldn't be said in English compressed into a moment of connection that Jack would carry with him, however long he had left to carry anything. Then she was moving, gathering Lily and sliding the trapdoor open, disappearing into darkness below. Jack positioned himself by the broken window rifle, ready and prepared to make his last stand. The standoff stretched across the darkness like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Jack Thornton kept his Winchester trained on the yard, tracking shadows that moved with military precision beyond the reach of his lamplight. 20 men, maybe more, all of them armed and positioned to turn his ranch house into a coffin. The odds were impossible, the situation hopeless, and Jack found himself thinking that this was a fitting end for a man who'd spent his life making hard choices and living with their consequences. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The explosion came from the direction of the horse corral, a flash of light, and a boom that rattled windows and sent horses screaming in terror. Jack's head whipped around in time to see flames leaping skyward, the old hay barn catching fire like it had been waiting all its life for this moment. Blackwood's men, caught completely off guard, wheeled their horses toward the new threat, and in that moment of confusion, everything changed. Gunfire erupted from a new direction, rifle shots cracking from the ridge beyond the ranch house. Jack recognized the pattern of fire, the controlled bursts that spoke of trained marksmen rather than panicked amateurs. Someone was hitting Blackwood's flanks, creating crossfire, turning the siege into a battle with actual odds. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. He burst through his front door, Winchester blazing, dropping 2 of Blackwood's men before they could react. He was moving on pure cavalry instinct now, the training of his army days taking over his body, remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Move, fire, take cover. Keep moving, never stay still, make yourself a hard target. He reached the barn through smoke and chaos, found Ayanna and Lily already there with the horses saddled and ready. The efficiency of it would have surprised him if he'd had time to be surprised, but there was no time for anything except action. Behind them, the ranch house was starting to burn flames, licking at the wooden walls, and Jack felt a pang of loss for the home he'd built, the life he'd tried to create. "Go!" A voice shouted from near the corral, and Jack's heart leaped as he recognized it. Sheriff Ben Caldwell, his bad leg giving him an awkward gait as he ran through the firelight, 3 deputies at his back. Ben's face was set in grim determination, blood streaming from a wound on his shoulder, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Ben," Jack called out, "you crazy son of a bitch. Could say the same about you." Ben fired twice over his shoulder, covering their retreat. "Go north through Devil's Canyon. I sent word to Thomas Redwing. His people will hide you." "Come with us," Jack urged, but Ben was already shaking his head. "Someone's got to stay and make this look convincing. Give you enough of a head start that they can't catch you before you reach Apache territory." Ben pressed extra ammunition into Jack's hands, his grip firm, despite the blood making his fingers slick. "Get that treaty to the territorial capital. Get it to Governor Wallace. He's the only one with authority to overrule Blackwood." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but he could see in Ben's eyes that this was not a debate. This was a friend cashing in every chip they'd ever earned together, paying back debts that went all the way to Cuban jungles, and bullets that could have ended either of their lives. "I owe you," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved my life at San Juan Hill," Ben replied, and even through the pain and blood he managed a grim smile. "Carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in my leg. Figure this makes us about even." There was no time for more. Jack clasped Ben's hand once hard, then turned to where Ayanna waited with the horses. She'd already mounted Lily secure in front of her, and she'd readied Jack's big black Morgan stallion Soldier. The horse danced nervously, spooked by the fire and gunshots, but calmed when Jack swung into the saddle. They thundered out the back of the barn, Ben's covering fire, giving them the seconds they needed. Behind them, the night lit up with flames as the bunkhouse caught fire. Jack glanced back once and saw Ben Caldwell standing in the firelight, rifle raised a silhouette of defiance against the burning ranch. It was the last time Jack would see his friend whole and standing, and the image would burn itself into his memory as permanently as any brand. The ride north was brutal. Jack pushed them hard, using every cavalry trick he knew to mask their trail. They rode through streams to hide their tracks, crossed rocky ground that would show no prints, doubled back, and circled around to confuse anyone trying to follow. Lily rode with Ayanna, the child's small arms wrapped tight around her mother's waist, her face buried against Ayanna's back. She never made a sound, never complained, and Jack felt his respect for her courage growing with every mile. They rode through the remainder of the night stars, wheeling overhead in their eternal dance, the land around them transformed into silver and shadow by the moon. Jack knew this country had tracked Apache through these canyons and arroyos back in his army days, but Ayanna knew it better. She guided them through passages he'd forgotten existed, along trails that seemed to materialize from bare rock into the deep country, where white men's maps meant nothing and the old ways still held sway. Dawn found them 10 miles north of the ranch, deep in the labyrinth of canyons that gave Devil's Pass its name. Jack called a halt in a narrow defile where an overhang provided shelter and a small spring bubbled from the rock. The horses needed rest, and so did they. Lily was asleep in the saddle, exhausted beyond endurance, but still clinging to her mother. Ayanna dismounted carefully, cradling Lily, and laid the child down on a bed of Jack's saddle blanket. The girl never stirred, lost in the deep sleep of the utterly spent. Ayanna stroked her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness, then rose and came to stand beside Jack as he kept watch on their back trail. "Your friend," she said quietly, "the sheriff. He will die for helping us." It wasn't a question, and Jack didn't insult her by pretending otherwise. Maybe. Ben's tough, and he's got the law on his side, at least technically. But yeah, it's going to cost him. Badge at minimum, maybe jail time if Blackwood pushes it. This troubles you. Ben's the best man I know, doesn't deserve to pay for my choices. Ayanna was silent for a moment, staring out at the desert landscape painted in the soft colors of dawn. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Jack look at her more closely. "When I was young, maybe Lily's age, my grandmother told me a story. She said that in the beginning times, Coyote asked the Great Spirit why some people must suffer for doing good things. The Great Spirit answered that suffering for good is what makes a person's spirit strong, that those who never risk anything for others never become truly human." Ayanna met Jack's eyes. "Your friend chose to become fully human. That is not something to regret." The simple wisdom of it hit Jack harder than he'd expected. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and returned his attention to the trail behind them. Nothing moved in the dawn light except the wind stirring the sage, but Jack knew better than to trust apparent emptiness. Blackwood would be coming, and he'd be coming hard. They rested for 2 hours, long enough for the horses to drink and graze on the sparse grass near the spring, long enough for Lily to wake and eat a little of the dried meat and hardtack Jack had brought. The child was quiet, still processing the terror of the previous night, but she seemed to draw strength from her mother's presence. She stayed close to Ayanna, one small hand always touching her, as if afraid that letting go might mean losing her again. When they mounted up to continue, the sun was fully risen and the day promised to be brutally hot. Jack set a more moderate pace, knowing that pushing too hard would kill the horses, and dead horses meant dead people in this country. They wound deeper into the canyons, following paths that seemed to exist more in Ayanna's memory than in any visible reality. It was mid-afternoon when Jack heard it, a sound so faint that most men would have missed it entirely, but Jack's ears had been trained in hard schools, metal on stone, the distinctive clink of a horse's shoe striking rock, behind them and closing the distance. "We've got company," he said quietly, and Ayanna's head came up, her whole body going alert. She listened for a moment, then nodded. "At least 5 riders, maybe more, moving fast. Can we outrun them?" "Not with tired horses and a child." Ayanna's voice was calm, already calculating alternatives. "But I know a place. If we can reach it, we can make them pay for every step." They urged their horses to greater speed, pushing them as hard as they dared through increasingly narrow passages. The canyon walls rose higher on either side, blocking out the sun, creating a twilight world of shadow and stone. Jack could hear their pursuers more clearly, now the sounds of multiple horsemen calling to each other in terse military shouts. Blackwood's men closing in like wolves on wounded prey. The canyon opened suddenly into a wider space, a box canyon with walls too steep to climb. Jack's heart sank. They were trapped, exactly the situation he'd been trying to avoid. But Ayanna was already dismounting, pulling Lily from the saddle, gesturing urgently toward what looked like a solid rock wall. "There," she said. "Can you see it?" Jack looked hard and saw nothing but stone. Then Ayanna moved, slipping sideways into a crack in the rock face that his eyes had passed over a dozen times without registering. It was an optical illusion, 2 walls of rock that seemed to be one continuous surface, but were actually separated by a gap barely wide enough for a person to pass through. "Take Lily," Ayanna said, pressing her daughter toward Jack. "I will bring the horses." "The horses won't fit." "I know." Ayanna's voice was heavy with regret. "But if we leave them here, the soldiers will know we are near. I will drive them north away from the passage. They will follow the horses and think we are still mounted." "That's suicide," Jack protested, but Ayanna was already moving, gathering the reins of all 3 horses. "I am Apache. I know these canyons better than they know their own boots. I will lose them and circle back." She met his eyes, and Jack saw determination that would not be argued with. "Protect my daughter. That is all I ask." Before Jack could argue further, the first shots rang out. Blackwood's men had entered the canyon, 5 riders fanning out with military precision. Ayanna didn't hesitate. She vaulted onto her horse, leading Jack's mount and the spare, and charged straight at the approaching soldiers. The move was so unexpected, so audacious, that it caught them completely off guard. Bullets kicked up dust around her, but Ayanna rode like she was born in the saddle, low and fast, using the horses as moving cover. She broke through their line before they could adjust their fire, and then she was through racing north with the spare horses in tow. The soldiers wheeled to pursue, shouting orders, completely focused on the fleeing rider. Jack didn't wait to see more. He grabbed Lily, who was staring after her mother with terrified eyes, and plunged into the hidden passage. The gap was so narrow that Jack had to turn sideways, his shoulders scraping rock on both sides. Lily he carried against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the rough stone. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, getting darker as they moved away from the entrance. Then suddenly they emerged into a different world. The passage opened into a hidden canyon, a place that seemed untouched by the outside world. Cottonwood trees grew thick around a clear pool fed by a spring that fell from high above. Ancient pictographs decorated the stone surfaces, faded images of hunters and animals and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. It was cool here, shaded a sanctuary carved from stone and water, but Jack had no time to appreciate the beauty. He was listening for sounds of pursuit, straining to hear if Ayanna's desperate gambit had worked. Minutes passed, like hours. Lily stood pressed against him, trembling, her small hand gripping his shirt with desperate strength. Then from the passage behind them came the sound of footsteps, slow, careful moving through the narrow gap. Jack drew his revolver, positioning himself between Lily and whatever was coming. If Blackwood's men had found the entrance, he'd make them pay for every inch of ground. A figure emerged from the passage, and Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Then recognition flooded through him, followed by relief so intense it made him dizzy. Ayanna stepped into the hidden canyon, dusty and scratched from the rough passage, but whole and alive. Lily gave a cry and launched herself at her mother. Ayanna caught her, holding her close, and over Lily's head her eyes met Jack's. In that look was gratitude and respect, and something else, something deeper, that Jack didn't have words for. "They followed the horses north," Ayanna said when she could speak. "By the time they realize the trick, we will be far from here." "That was the bravest damn fool thing I've ever seen," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control. "And I've seen some brave damn fool things." "I told you, I know these canyons." Ayanna set Lily down, but kept one hand on her daughter's shoulder, that constant need for contact that Jack was beginning to understand. "And I keep my promises. I promise to come back for her." They rested in the hidden canyon for the remainder of the afternoon. There was no way forward until dark, Ayanna explained. The passage out was on the far side, and it emerged into open ground that would expose them to anyone watching. Better to wait for night, when Apache knowledge of the land would give them an advantage over soldiers who relied on sight alone. As the sun set and the hidden canyon filled with twilight shadows, Ayanna built a small fire so tiny and carefully constructed that it produced almost no smoke. She had some dried meat and corn cakes in a pouch she'd carried, and they ate sparingly, knowing that supplies would have to last. Lily fell asleep with her head in her mother's lap, exhausted by terror and flight, and the simple relief of being reunited. "Tell me about your husband," Jack said quietly, keeping his voice low so as not to wake the sleeping child. "About Dakota." Ayanna was silent for a long time, her fingers stroking Lily's dark hair with an absent, tender motion. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of grief still fresh and raw. "Dakota was a good man, a wise man. He believed that our people could live in peace with yours if both sides honored their agreements. The treaty that the government wants to pretend does not exist, Dakota negotiated that with Governor Ross in 1886. He was young then, only 25, but he spoke with the wisdom of the elders. Governor Ross respected him, called him a man of honor." "What happened to Ross?" "He died 7 years ago, heart failure. With him died the memory in your government that we had legal rights to our land. New men came, men who saw only the turquoise in our mountains and not the people who lived there." "And Blackwood," Ayanna's face hardened. "He came 3 months ago, said he was there to make sure we were following reservation rules. We showed him the treaty proved we were on our own land legally. He smiled and said that was all very interesting, and then he left. 1 month later, the surveyors came. 2 weeks after that, the massacre. He needed to eliminate the evidence, Jack said, understanding the cold logic of it. Anyone who knew about the treaty, anyone who could testify to its authenticity, kill them all, destroy the documents, and suddenly the land is just vacant territory available for development. Except he did not find the treaty. Dakota kept the original hidden in a sacred place known only to him and his brother. The copy I carry is enough to prove our case if we can get it to people who care about justice. That's a big if, Jack said. Men like Blackwood have powerful friends, mining interests, political connections, military authority. Going up against that with just a piece of paper and testimony from people the government already wants to disappear, that's a hard road. But not an impossible one. Jack studied her face, seeing the hope and determination warring in her eyes, and he couldn't bring himself to lie. Not impossible, just hard. We'd need to get to Santa Fe, file the treaty with the federal land court, get a judge to issue an injunction against relocation. We'd need witnesses who knew about the original treaty, signing people with credibility that couldn't be dismissed. And we'd need to do it all before Blackwood's people kill us or disappear us. You say we, Ayanna observed. You could leave now. Take your chances on your own. No one would blame you for abandoning people you barely know. Jack thought about that. About the ranch that was probably nothing but ashes now. About Ben Caldwell sacrificing his badge and maybe his freedom. About a 7-year-old girl who'd looked at him with eyes that trusted despite having every reason not to. I could, he agreed, but then I'd have to live with it. And I've already got enough regrets to last a lifetime. Don't need to add leaving a child to die to that list. Ayanna smiled a small, sad smile that held understanding. You are a good man, Jackson Thornton. Your wife was fortunate. She died 2 years ago. Jack said, the words coming easier than they used to. Influenza. We never had children. Always meant to, but time kept passing, and then there wasn't any more time. Dakota died of the same sickness 4 years ago. Before that, I thought we had all the time in the world. Then suddenly, we had none. Ayanna looked down at Lily. She was only 3, barely remembers her father. I have tried to keep his memory alive for her, but memories fade, especially when you are so young. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned down to coals. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the ribbon of sky overhead. Jack found himself thinking about time and loss, and the strange paths that bring people together. 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary rancher, trying to forget his past. Now he was a fugitive, helping people he barely knew, and somehow it felt more right than anything he'd done in years. We should sleep, Ayanna said eventually. I will take first watch. In 3 hours, I wake you. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to say that he should take first watch since he was the soldier, but he could see in her eyes that this was not negotiable. Ayanna had been running and hiding and surviving for days before she'd found her daughter. She was running on pure determination and mother's will, and arguing would be disrespectful. He found a relatively smooth patch of ground near the dying fire and lay down using his saddlebag as a pillow. Despite the hard ground and the danger and the uncertain future, sleep came quickly. His last conscious thought was of Ayanna's silhouette against the starlight standing watch over her daughter and the strange white man who'd stumbled into their war. Jack woke to a hand over his mouth and Ayanna's voice urgent in his ear. Quiet. We have company. He came awake instantly, years of military training kicking in. Ayanna removed her hand and Jack sat up slowly listening. At first he heard nothing but the normal night sounds of the desert. Then it came faint but unmistakable. Voices, men talking in low tones trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. Close. Too close. Ayanna had already gathered Lily, who was awake but silent, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Jack checked his guns, making sure they were loaded and ready. The hidden canyon had seemed like perfect refuge, but now it felt like a trap. If Blackwood's men found the entrance, there would be nowhere to run. The voices grew clearer, and Jack realized with a shock that they weren't speaking English. They were speaking Apache. He looked at Ayanna and saw her face transformed by hope and fear in equal measure. "My people," she whispered. "Thomas Redwing, he came. So how can you be sure they're friendly? Because if they were not, they would have already killed us." As if in answer, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the passage, speaking in Apache. Ayanna answered her voice, carrying clearly in the still night air. A conversation followed rapid exchanges that Jack couldn't follow, and then Ayanna turned to him. "They wish to speak with you. Thomas Redwing, he is Takota's brother. He leads what remains of our people." She paused, then added, "He is not certain about you. A white man, former Army scout, now claiming to help us. He wants to see your eyes when you speak." "Fair enough," Jack said. "I'd be suspicious too." They made their way through the narrow passage, Lily between them, and emerged into the box canyon on the other side. A dozen men waited there, Apache warriors armed with rifles and bows' faces painted for war. In the center stood a man who could only be Thomas Redwing. He was perhaps 55 tall for an Apache, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. His eyes were hard and measuring as they fixed on Jack, and Jack met that gaze without flinching. He'd learned long ago that showing weakness to men like this was the fastest way to lose their respect. Thomas Redwing spoke, his voice deep and carrying authority that needed no translation. Ayanna interpreted. "He says you wear cavalry boots. You smell of the army. Why should he believe you help us and not spy for Blackwood? Tell him I was army," Jack said, speaking to Redwing but letting Ayanna translate. 15 years ago, I tracked Apache, fought Apache, helped relocate Apache to reservations. I did what I was told because I believed I was serving justice. Then I watched an officer named Blackwood order the murder of civilians, women and children, and old folks who'd never raised a weapon. I reported him. Nothing happened. The dead stayed dead and Blackwood kept his command, so I resigned. Figured if that was justice, I wanted no part of it. Ayanna translated, and Redwing listened without expression. When she finished, he spoke again, his words sharp and challenging. "He says men lie easily when their lives depend on it. Why should he trust the word of someone who once hunted his people?" Jack thought about that, about trust and proof and the vast gulf between words and actions. Then he did something that made Ayanna gasp and the warrior's tense hands moving toward weapons. He removed his gun belt, the Colt, and all the ammunition and held it out to Thomas Redwing. "Tell him I can't prove my words are true. All I can do is trust that his are. I'm putting my life in his hands. If he decides I'm lying, I won't be able to stop him from killing me. That's the only proof I can offer, the same trust I'm asking him to give me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the night insects seemed to hold their breath. Redwing stared at Jack and Jack stared back, and between them passed an understanding that needed no words. This was the Apache way, the old way. Trust earned through vulnerability, honor proven through risk. Finally, Redwing reached out and took the gun belt. He examined the Colt, his fingers tracing the worn grip with the touch of someone who understood weapons. Then he spoke, and this time there was something in his voice that might have been respect. Ayanna's voice shook slightly as she translated. "He says you are either very brave or very foolish, perhaps both. He says that Lily speaks well of you, says you treated her wound with skill, and gave her food and water, when you could have taken the bounty. He says children do not lie about such things." She paused. "He says you may come to our camp, but if you betray us, he will personally kill you in ways that make death welcome." "Fair terms," Jack said, and he meant it. Redwing handed the gun belt back, a gesture that spoke volumes. Jack strapped it on, feeling the familiar weight return to his hip, and something in the careful neutrality of the warriors' faces told him he'd passed some kind of test. The journey to the Apache camp took 3 hours, moving through darkness over ground that seemed impossible to navigate, but that the Apache warriors traversed with the confidence of people who'd walked these paths since childhood. Lily rode with one of the warriors, giving Ayanna a chance to speak with her brother-in-law, their voices low and urgent as they discussed things Jack couldn't hear. They arrived at the hidden camp just as false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. It was tucked into a box canyon so well concealed that Jack would have ridden past it a dozen times without seeing the entrance. Inside, perhaps 20 people huddled around small fires, faces showing the trauma of recent horror. Women, children, a few elderly men. These were the survivors of Blackwood's massacre, all that remained of a people who'd lived in these mountains for generations. The camp went silent as Jack entered. Hostile eyes fixed on him, seeing the white skin and cavalry boots and drawing conclusions that needed no words. He was the enemy, the invader, the kind of man who'd brought death and destruction to their lives. And they were right to think it, because he had been that man once, even if he'd tried to leave that person behind. Thomas Redwing spoke to the gathered people, his voice carrying authority and command. Whatever he said seemed to ease some of the tension, though the hostile stares didn't entirely disappear. Ayanna touched Jack's arm, guiding him toward one of the fires, where an elderly woman tended a pot of something that smelled better than anything had a right to smell, given the circumstances. "This is Nietzsche," Ayanna said. "She is our medicine woman. She will tend your wounds." "I'm not wounded," Jack protested, but Nietzsche was already pulling him down to sit beside the fire. Her hands, gnarled with age but still strong, probed at his ribs, where he'd taken a hard blow during the fight with Ayanna the night before. He winced despite himself. "You are wounded," Ayanna said, with something that might have been amusement. "I hit you harder than I meant to when we fought." Nietzsche spoke in Apache, her voice carrying the crackle of old wood, and Ayanna translated. "She says you fight well for a white man, but you fight like you do not wish to hurt your opponent. This is foolish in war, but honorable in other circumstances." "Tell her I've hurt enough people in my life," Jack said. "These days, I try to avoid adding to that count." After Nietzsche had finished wrapping his ribs with strips of cloth that smelled of herbs Jack couldn't identify, Thomas Redwing approached and gestured for Jack to follow. They walked to the edge of the camp where the cliff face towered above them, covered in pictographs that might have been centuries old. Redwing spoke, and this time he spoke in English, accented but clear. Jack realized the man had understood everything he'd said earlier, had chosen to use Ayanna as translator as another test. "You say you wish to help us. I believe you believe this. But belief and ability are not the same thing. What can one white man do against the United States Army?" "I can get that treaty to Santa Fe," Jack said. "I can testify to what I saw, what I know about Blackwood. I've got friends, people who might listen. It's not much, but it's something. And if it fails, if the white man's courts do not care about our treaty, do not care about our dead," Jack met his eyes, "then at least we tried. At least we fought for what was right, instead of just accepting what was wrong. That's got to count for something." Redwing was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to where Lily was being fed by one of the women, her small face finally showing something other than fear. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of responsibility. "Lily tells me you made her a promise, that you would find her mother. You kept that promise. Now, I ask you for another promise. If we trust you, if we give you our sacred treaty and our testimonies, will you fight for us even when the fighting seems hopeless? Will you stand for justice even when justice seems impossible?" Jack thought about Ben Caldwell standing in the flames of a burning ranch to buy time for people he'd never met. About Ayanna riding straight at armed soldiers to protect her daughter. About a 7-year-old girl who'd hidden in a barn, terrified and bleeding, but still clutching the document that was her people's only hope. "I promise," Jack said, and meant it with everything he had. Redwing extended his hand, not in the white man's way, but palm up, a gesture of equals offering trust. Jack placed his hand over Redwing's, and between them passed an understanding that would bind them through the trials ahead. The sun was fully up now, bathing the rock faces in shades of gold and crimson, And Jack Thornton stood among the people he'd once been paid to hunt, now sworn to protect them with his life. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the rightness of it. Sometimes redemption came in strange packages, and sometimes the only way forward was through the very doors you'd spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Thomas Redwing called the people together, and in the growing light of morning, surrounded by survivors and witnesses, the real planning began. The Apache camp stirred to life as the sun climbed higher, painting the hidden canyon in shades of amber and rust. Jack Thornton sat cross-legged beside Thomas Redwing's fire, a cup of bitter root tea warming his hands, watching as the survivors of Blackwood's massacre went about the business of staying alive. Children too young to understand the full weight of what had happened played quietly near their mothers. Women prepared what little food they had, stretching meager supplies with the kind of resourcefulness born from generations of survival. The elderly sat in small groups, their faces carved with grief for the dead and determination for the living. Jack felt the weight of their eyes on him, measuring, judging, trying to reconcile what they knew of white men with the reality of one who claimed to stand with them. He didn't blame them for their suspicion. Trust was a currency that had to be earned, especially when the price of misplaced trust was measured in bodies and burning homes. Thomas Redwing spoke his words, drawing everyone's attention, and the activity gradually ceased as people gathered around the central fire. Ayanna moved to stand beside Jack Lily's small hand clasped firmly in hers. The child looked better this morning. Some color returned to her cheeks, though her eyes still carried shadows too deep for someone so young. "My brother-in-law wishes to hold counsel," Ayanna said quietly to Jack. "He will ask the elders and warriors to decide our path forward. You will be asked to speak. What should I say? The truth. It is all any of us can offer now." The council assembled with practiced formality. 4 elders, 3 warriors, and Ayanna as keeper of the treaty. Jack stood until Redwing gestured for him to sit. Standing Bear, eldest among them, spoke first. Ayanna translated, "He has watched his people forced from their homes 7 times. He has signed 3 treaties with white men, all broken. Why should this time be different?" Jack spoke slowly, letting Ayanna translate. "I can't promise it will be different. What I can promise is that I will fight for your cause with everything I have. I've been part of the machinery that destroys people like you. This is my chance to balance the scales." Standing Bear's response was blunt. "Words are wind. Why should we believe your heart is different from your face? Giu Nguyen, fan metal burning, de la core emotional moment." The silence that followed was profound. Standing, Bear's eyes studied Jack with piercing intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its hardness. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Jack felt the eyes of every person in the camp on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He thought about all the justifications he could offer, all the explanations of his past and his intentions. Then he realized that words truly were wind, and what these people needed was something more substantial. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch worn smooth from years of carrying. From it, he extracted a medal tarnished with age but still recognizable. It was a military commendation awarded for valor during the Philippine campaign, the same campaign where he'd first encountered Blackwood's brutality. "This," Jack said, holding up the medal so all could see, "was given to me for following orders that resulted in the deaths of civilians, women and children who were in a village we suspected of harboring insurgents. I was told I'd done my duty, that I'd served with honor." He paused, feeling the familiar shame rise in his throat. "I've carried this for 12 years as a reminder of what I became when I stopped questioning orders, when I let other men's evil become my own." He stood and walked to the fire at the center of the gathering. Without hesitation, he dropped the medal into the flames. The metal glowed red, then white, as fire consumed the ribbon and began to tarnish the bronze. "I can't undo what I did," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't bring back the dead or make right what was wrong. All I can do is choose differently now, stand for what's right, even when it costs everything. That's not words. That's a promise written in whatever time I have left." The silence that followed was profound. Even the children had stopped their quiet play, sensing the gravity of the moment. Standing Bear's eyes sharp, despite his age, studied Jack with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hardness. Ayanna translated, and her voice carried a note of surprise. "He says you have the courage to face your shame. This is rare in any man, rarer still in a white soldier. He says the council will consider your words and your actions together." The four elders withdrew to confer, their voices too low for Jack to hear, even if he could have understood the language. The waiting stretched out tense and uncertain, while Jack stood beside the fire and watched his metal slowly melt into shapeless metal. It felt right somehow to watch it destroyed, like cutting away infected flesh to save the body. Lily approached him, moving with the careful steps of a child who'd learned to be quiet and unobtrusive. She looked up at him with a gaze too solemn for one so young, then did something that made Jack's throat tighten. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones with complete trust. "Papa Jack," she said softly, using the name she'd given him in a moment of terror and exhaustion. The watching Apache saw their youngest survivor choosing to stand with the white man, and Jack could feel the shift in atmosphere like a change in the wind. Ayanna came to stand on his other side, and when she spoke, she pitched her voice loud enough for all to hear. "This man found my daughter when she was hiding and terrified. He could have taken the bounty money, $500 for turning her over to Blackwood's men. Instead, he treated her wounds, fed her, protected her. When I came for her with a knife in my hand, ready to kill anyone who stood between us, he fought only to defend himself, never to harm me. When Blackwood's men surrounded his home, he sent us to safety while he faced certain death." She looked at Jack, and in her eyes was something that made his heart beat faster. "I have seen evil men, and I have seen good men. Jackson Thornton is good even when being good costs him everything." The elders returned, and Standing Bear spoke with the authority of the council's decision. Ayanna's translation came with barely suppressed relief. "The council has voted 4-3 in favor of trusting you." She paused. "But there is a condition. Thomas Redwing must accompany you to Santa Fe. If this is a betrayal, if you lead us into a trap, he will kill you before you can do further harm to his people." Jack stared unflinchingly at Redwing and saw there the cold promise of exactly that. "Fair terms," he said, and meant it. "Good," Redwing said in English, surprising some of the gathered people who hadn't known he spoke the language. "We leave tomorrow at dawn. Tonight we prepare." The rest of that day passed in a flurry of activity. Jack worked alongside the Apache warriors, helping to organize supplies for the journey to Santa Fe, sharing what he knew of the territory they'd have to cross and the dangers they'd likely face. The warriors were professionals. He quickly realized, men who'd been fighting for survival their entire lives and had learned lessons written in blood and loss. One of the younger warriors, a man perhaps 28 with quick eyes and quicker hands, approached Jack as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. His name, Ayanna told him, was Grey Wolf, and he'd been one of Dakota's most trusted fighters. "You know the white man's military," Grey Wolf said through Ayanna's translation. "How will they try to stop us?" Jack appreciated the directness. "Blackwood will have men watching all the main roads to Santa Fe. He'll have scouts in the passes, maybe even men inside the city itself. He knows we're heading. There knows that's our only real chance. So he'll try to intercept us before we can file that treaty with the territorial court. Then we do not take the main roads. No, we don't. But even the back trails, he'll have them covered. Blackwood's not stupid, just evil. He'll anticipate that we'll try to be clever." Jack paused, thinking through the tactical problem. "What we need is a diversion. Something to draw his attention and his men away from our actual route. Redwing, who'd been listening from nearby, moved closer. What do you suggest? We split up. Small group takes the treaty toward Santa Fe using the hidden trails you know. Larger group makes a lot of noise on the main roads, leads Blackwood's men on a chase in the wrong direction. Jack met Redwing's eyes. Dangerous for the group, that's the decoy. They'll have superior numbers hunting them. But the group with the treaty will have a better chance of reaching Santa Fe, Redwing finished. He considered this for a moment. I will lead the decoy group. You and Ayanna take the treaty. No, Ayanna said sharply, and both men turned to look at her. Lily needs to go with the decoy group. If Blackwood captures the treaty group, they will torture and kill everyone. But if they capture the decoy group and Lily is with them, Blackwood will hesitate. He knows I will never stop hunting him if he harms my daughter. It gives the decoy group leverage. Jack started to protest, hating the idea of deliberately putting the child in danger, but he could see the cold logic of it. Blackwood was many things, but he wasn't completely without survival instinct. Killing a 7-year-old girl would make him a monster, even by frontier standards, would turn public opinion against him in ways that might overcome even his political connections. Having Lily with the decoy group was insurance, terrible insurance, but insurance nonetheless. I don't like it, Jack said. Neither do I, Ayanna replied. But we do not have the luxury of only choosing options we like. We must choose what gives us the best chance of success. Redwing nodded slowly. Ayanna speaks wisdom. Grey Wolf will go with her and the white man to Santa Fe. I will take Lily and 10 warriors on the main road. We will make much noise, leave obvious trail. Blackwood's men will follow us while the treaty reaches safety. The plan was set then, and with it came the heavy knowledge that they were deliberately separating a mother from her daughter, putting that child at risk as a tactical necessity. Jack saw the pain it caused Ayanna, the way her hand tightened on Lily's shoulder, the brightness of unshed tears in her eyes. But she didn't protest further, didn't let her mother's heart override the cold calculation of what needed to be done. That evening, as the sun set and turned the canyon walls to fire, Jack found himself sitting with Ayanna and Lily near the edge of the camp. Lily was between them, leaning against her mother, and the three of them watched the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. When I was small, Ayanna said quietly, my grandmother taught me the stories of the stars. She said each light was a warrior who had died with honor placed in the sky by the Great Spirit to watch over the living and guide them through darkness. That's beautiful, Jack said. She also said that the brightest stars were those who had suffered most in life, who had faced the greatest darkness and still held to what was right. Their light shined stronger because it was tested by shadow. Ayanna looked at him. I think you will be a bright star one day, Jackson Thornton. I'd rather stay right here, Jack replied, and was surprised by how much he meant it. Seems like I've spent my whole life running from one thing or another. First, I ran toward the Army, thinking military service would give my life meaning. Then I ran from the Army when I saw what it had made me, ran to ranching, thinking I could build a quiet life and forget the past. Now here I sit, running again, but this time it feels different. Different how? Jack thought about that, searching for words to match the feeling. Like I'm finally running toward something instead of away. Like maybe all that running was just a long road to get me here to this moment, to a place where I could actually make a difference. Lily had fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's events, her small head resting against her mother's shoulder. Ayanna stroked her daughter's hair with infinite gentleness, and when she spoke again, her voice carried depths of emotion that made Jack's chest ache. Dakota used to say that the Great Spirit puts people in each other's paths for a reason, that there are no accidents, only meetings we don't yet understand the purpose of. She looked at Jack, and in the starlight, her face held a beauty that went beyond mere features. I think he was right. You were meant to find Lily. We were meant to find each other, not by accident, but because there is something we are meant to do together. The weight of those words hung between them, charged with meaning that went beyond the immediate crisis. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart after his wife's death beginning to crack. Ayanna was watching him, and in her eyes he saw recognition of his feelings and perhaps an echo of them in her own heart. "When this is over," Jack said, the words coming before he could stop them, "when we've delivered that treaty and fought whatever fights need fighting, I want to ask you something. But not now. Not when we're running for our lives and the future is so uncertain. When we can sit somewhere safe and think about tomorrow without wondering if we'll live to see it." "I know what you want to ask," Ayanna said softly, "and I know what my answer will be. But you are right. Some questions deserve to be asked when there is time to honor them properly." When they sat in comfortable silence after that three people who'd become a temporary family through circumstances and choice, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the quiet sounds of the camp settling for the night. Tomorrow would bring danger and separation and all the risks inherent in their desperate plan. But tonight, for a few hours, they could simply be. Dawn came too soon, painting the canyon walls with light that seemed to mock the darkness of what they were about to do. The camp was already awake, warriors checking weapons, women packing what little could be carried. The atmosphere was tense with the knowledge that this might be the last time they saw each other, that the decision made yesterday could lead to capture or death for some or all of them. Jack watched Ayanna say goodbye to Lily, and it was one of the hardest things he'd ever witnessed. The mother knelt before her daughter, holding the child's face in both hands, speaking in rapid Apache that carried all the love and fear and desperate hope of a parent sending a child into danger. Lily was crying, silent tears running down her small face, but she nodded at whatever her mother was saying, showing courage that shamed Jack for every moment he'd ever complained about hardship in his comfortable life. Finally, Ayanna pressed her forehead to Lily's, a gesture Jack had learned was one of profound connection among her people, and spoke words that even without translation carried the weight of a blessing and a promise. Then she stood, and though her face was composed, Jack could see the cost of that composure in the tightness around her eyes. Lily walked to Jack, looked up at him with eyes that held both courage and fear, and said in careful English, "You keep Mama safe." Jack knelt down to her level. "I promise, little one, with my life." Lily nodded, satisfied with that answer, in the way only children can be seeing truth where adults might hear only comfortable words. She hugged him quick and fierce, then ran to Thomas Redwing's side. Redwing placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his face showing nothing of what he felt but his eyes. When they met, Jack's carried a clear message. "Bring Ayanna back whole, or don't come back at all." The two groups prepared to separate, moving to opposite ends of the canyon. Grey Wolf joined Jack and Ayanna, along with two other warriors who would serve as scouts and guards. They traveled light, carrying only weapons, basic supplies, and, most importantly, the treaty document wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from the elements. Redwing's larger group was mounted and armed, ready to make a show of force and draw attention. They would head north first, then swing east toward Santa Fe on the main road, making sure they were seen, making sure Blackwood's scouts reported their presence. By the time Blackwood realized he was chasing a decoy, Jack and Ayanna should be close enough to Santa Fe to make a final dash for the territorial capital. Should be. The whole plan rested on assumptions and hopes and the slender thread of luck. "Be careful," Jack said to Redwing, the words inadequate for what he wanted to express. "Always," Redwing replied. Then, surprising Jack, he extended his arm in the Apache way, palm up. Jack placed his hand over Redwing's, and the older man's grip was iron strong. "You have proven yourself, white man. But if you fail to protect my sister-in-law, I will hunt you across this world and the next." "Understood," Jack said, and meant it. They parted, then the two groups heading in opposite directions, each carrying with them the hopes and survival of people who'd already lost too much. Jack led his small party south, away from the obvious routes into country that only Apache and the most skilled trackers knew existed. Gray Wolf moved ahead as Point Scout, his knowledge of the land absolute, finding paths through terrain that looked impassable to Jack's trained but foreign eyes. They traveled hard through the morning and into the afternoon, pushing themselves and their horses to the edge of endurance. The land here was brutal, all rock and thorn and heat that sucked moisture from the body faster than you could replace it. But it was also beautiful in its harsh way, sculpted by wind and time into shapes that seemed to belong more to dreams than reality. Around mid-afternoon, Gray Wolf raised his hand in the signal to stop. The small party froze, hands going to weapons, every sense alert for danger. Gray Wolf slipped back from his position, his face troubled. "Riders ahead," he said in accented but clear English. "Many riders, military, I think. They wait in the canyon. We must pass through to continue south." Jack's gut tightened. "How many? 15, maybe 20. Too many to fight. We must turn back, find another way." But there was no other way, not one that wouldn't add days to their journey, and days were a luxury they couldn't afford. Jack thought fast, weighing options and finding them all bad. Then an idea struck him, dangerous and probably stupid, but their situation was already dangerous, and his recent decisions hadn't exactly been characterized by caution. "What if we didn't look like we were trying to sneak past?" Jack said. "What if we looked like we were supposed to be there?" Ayanna and Gray Wolf both turned to stare at him. "Explain," Ayanna said. "I'm a white man, former Army scout known to have worked these territories. You're my Apache guides helping me track some renegades. It's thin, but if I walk in there confident like I belong, maybe they won't look too close. Most soldiers out here have never seen me, don't know I've gone rogue. They just know Blackwood's looking for an Apache woman and child. You're not with a child, and I'm clearly in charge. We might be able to bluff our way through. Or we might all die," Gray Wolf observed, but there was consideration in his voice rather than immediate rejection. "We might," Jack agreed. "But if we turn back now, we definitely fail. This might be our only chance." Ayanna looked at the two warriors with her, saw them nod slowly, accepting the risk. Then she looked back at Jack, and in her eyes was trust that terrified him, because he didn't know if he deserved it. "We try your plan," she said. "But if it fails, we fight our way out. No surrender." "No surrender," Jack agreed. They rode forward openly, making no attempt at stealth. Jack rode in front, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone who had every right to be exactly where he was. Ayanna and the three warriors followed at a respectful distance, playing the role of hired guides. It was all theater, all bluff, and Jack's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the canyon where the soldiers waited. The military patrol came into view exactly as Gray Wolf had described. 20 men under the command of a young lieutenant who looked fresh from West Point, all polish and regulation and by-the-book authority. The lieutenant raised his hand to halt his men, and they fanned out in a practiced pattern that spoke of real training. This wasn't some ragtag militia. These were professional cavalry, and that made them both more dangerous and potentially more susceptible to a confident bluff. "Hold there!" the lieutenant called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "State your name and business." Jack reined in his horse, making the movement casual, unhurried. Jack Thornton, formerly attached to the 3rd Cavalry as a civilian scout, currently under contract to track Apache renegades in cooperation with Colonel Blackwood's operation. "These are my guides. We're heading south to check reports of movement in that direction." It was a beautiful lie, specific enough to sound real, official enough to demand respect. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. Jack could see the young man's mind working, trying to decide if this grizzled rider was who he claimed or something else entirely. "I wasn't informed of any civilian contractors operating in this sector," the lieutenant said, and his hand drifted toward his sidearm, not threatening yet, but ready. "Wouldn't expect you to be," Jack replied, keeping his voice level and slightly condescending, the way a veteran might speak to a green officer. "Colonel Blackwood keeps his operations compartmentalized. Need-to-know basis. helps prevent information leaks to the targets we're tracking." The lieutenant didn't like being talked down. Jack could see that in the tightening of his jaw, but he also couldn't immediately discount what Jack was saying. It was exactly the kind of thing a man like Blackwood would do, keeping civilian assets secret from regular military to maintain operational security. "These Apache with you," the lieutenant said, gesturing toward Ayanna and the warriors. "They're cleared for this operation." "Best trackers in the territory," Jack said. "Colonel Blackwood personally approved their hire. You want to question his judgment? Lieutenant, you're welcome to ride back and ask him yourself, but that'll put you about 3 days behind schedule on your patrol, and I'm guessing he won't appreciate the delay." It was a calculated risk, invoking Blackwood's name and authority, while also making it inconvenient to verify. The lieutenant was young but not stupid, and Jack could see him working through the logic, trying to decide if the risk of letting them pass was greater than the risk of delaying his mission to check credentials. Finally, the lieutenant nodded, though his expression remained suspicious. "Proceed, but I'll be reporting this encounter to Colonel Blackwood at my next check-in. If your story doesn't match his records, he'll know where to find you." "Wouldn't expect anything less," Jack said, tipping his hat in a gesture that was just respectful enough not to be insulting. "Good hunting, Lieutenant." They rode past the patrol, every muscle in Jack's body tense, waiting for the shout or the gunshot that would mean the bluff had failed, but it didn't come. The soldiers watched them go, suspicious, but not certain enough to act, and within 10 minutes they'd rounded a bend that put rock between them and the patrol. "Keep riding," Jack said quietly. "Not fast enough to look like we're running, but fast enough to put distance between us and any second thoughts that Lieutenant might have." They maintained that careful pace for another hour before Grey Wolf finally allowed them to stop in a narrow defile that offered good cover and sight lines in all directions. Jack dismounted his legs, shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash, and found Ayanna looking at him with an expression that might have been admiration. "That was either very clever or very lucky," she said. "Little of both," Jack admitted. "Mostly I was terrified." "You did not show it. You spoke with the authority of truth even while lying." She paused. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Poker mostly," Jack said, and despite the tension, despite the danger, he found himself grinning. "Though I should mention I'm terrible at poker, lost more money than I care to remember. Guess I finally found a use for all those expensive lessons in bluffing." The absurdity of it seemed to strike them all at once, and suddenly they were laughing, tension breaking in waves of slightly hysterical mirth. It wasn't particularly funny, but they'd just talked their way past 20 armed soldiers while carrying the very document those soldiers had been sent to find and destroy. And if that wasn't worth laughing about, nothing was. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they made camp in the shelter of an overhang that would hide their fire from casual observation. Grey Wolf and the other warriors took up watch positions while Jack and Ayanna prepared the simple meal of dried meat and journey bread that would have to sustain them. "Tell me about your ranch," Ayanna said as they worked. "The one that burned. What was it like?" Jack thought about Blackwater Creek, about the home he'd built from nothing over 9 years of hard work and hope. "It was supposed to be my fresh start. After I left the army, after my wife died, I wanted somewhere I could be alone and quiet. Build something instead of destroying things. Raise cattle, maybe horses. Live a simple life and try to forget the complicated one I'd left behind." "Did it work? Did you forget?" "No," Jack admitted. "You can't forget, not really. Best you can do is learn to live with the memories, build new ones to balance against the old. The ranch was good for that. Honest work, clean work, the kind that leaves you tired at the end of the day, but satisfied. It was a good life. You grieve for it." "I do, but not as much as I thought I would. Funny thing is, these past few days running and fighting and probably heading toward my death, I've felt more alive than I did in all those years of peaceful ranching. Like maybe I needed this, needed a cause worth fighting for to remember who I was supposed to be." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her hands still busy with the preparations. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Jack look up from his work. "Dakota told me once that a man is not defined by the peace he makes, but by the battles he chooses to fight. That you can know the measure of a person by seeing what they will sacrifice for others." She met his eyes. "I think he would have liked you, Jackson Thornton, would have called you brother." The words hit Jack harder than he'd expected, carrying with them a validation he hadn't known he needed. To be accepted by the husband of the woman he was beginning to love, even posthumously, felt like a blessing and a permission both. "I wish I could have known him," Jack said honestly. "From everything I've heard, he was a better man than most I've served with." "He was good, but not perfect. No man is. He could be stubborn, too certain of his own rightness sometimes. We argued often about whether peace with the white man was possible. I said no, that your people would never honor their agreements. He said we had to try, that giving up hope was the same as accepting defeat." Her voice softened. "In the end, I was right, but I wish I had been wrong." They ate in companionable silence as night fell fully and the stars emerged in their thousands. Jack found himself thinking about paths not taken, about choices and consequences, and the strange way that terrible events could lead to profound connections. If Blackwood hadn't massacred Dakota's people, Jack would never have met Ayanna. If Lily hadn't stumbled into his barn, he'd still be living his quiet, empty life at Blackwater Creek, slowly dying of loneliness and calling it peace. "Do you believe in fate?" Ayanna asked, as if reading his thoughts. "That our paths are chosen for us before we walk them?" "I don't know," Jack said. "I'd like to believe we have choices, that we can shape our own lives. But I also can't deny that it feels like something led me to that barn at exactly the right moment to find Lily. Like all the decisions I've made, all the places I've been, were just steps on a road leading me to this moment." "My people believe both are true," Ayanna said. "That we have the freedom to choose, but that the Great Spirit guides us toward the choices we need to make, like a river that can flow different paths, but always heads toward the sea." It was a beautiful thought, and Jack held it close as the night deepened and the watch changed, and the small party of fugitives prepared for another day of running toward justice and away from death. Somewhere to the north, Lily rode with Thomas Redwing and the decoy party, drawing Blackwood's forces away from their trail. Somewhere ahead lay Santa Fe and the uncertain hope of legal justice. And here in this narrow canyon, under stars that had watched over this land for millennia, Jack Thornton found himself hoping that the path would lead not just to victory or defeat, but to a future where a broken soldier and a grieving widow might build something new from the ashes of their losses. Tomorrow would bring fresh dangers and hard miles. But tonight, for a few hours, they could rest and dream of a world where promises were kept and justice was more than just a word used by powerful men to justify their crimes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry them through the darkness toward whatever dawn awaited. The journey to Santa Fe took 4 more days of hard riding through country that seemed determined to kill them. They crossed alkali flats, where the sun reflected off white earth with blinding intensity, navigated slot canyons barely wide enough for a horse, and pushed through the final mountain passes as autumn's first cold began to bite at night. Gray Wolf proved invaluable, his knowledge of hidden water sources and game trails keeping them alive when the obvious routes would have led to certain death or capture. On the evening of the 4th day, they crested a ridge and saw Santa Fe spread below them, adobe buildings glowing orange in the setting sun. The territorial capital sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, looking both insignificant and impossibly important. Somewhere in those buildings was the Federal Land Court, the place where treaties were filed and legal battles were won or lost. "We made it," Ayanna said, her voice carrying wonder and exhaustion in equal measure. "We made it here," Jack corrected. "Now comes the hard part." They entered the city after dark, moving through streets that smelled of pinon smoke and cooking meat. Jack led them to a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a woman who'd shown him kindness during his army days and who asked no questions when he appeared with 3 Apache companions. She gave them rooms at the back, out of sight from the street, and brought them the first hot meal they'd had in days. "Federal court opens tomorrow at 9, Mrs. Chen said, setting down plates of beef and potatoes. Judge Harrison presides. He's fair, they say, though I don't know if that means anything when it comes to Indian affairs." Jack thanked her and waited until she'd left before speaking. "Tomorrow morning we file the treaty. Ayanna and I will go to the courthouse. Grey Wolf, you and the others stay here, keep watch. If this goes wrong, if we don't come back by noon, take the treaty copy we made and get it to the nearest newspaper. Let the court of public opinion finish what we started." Grey Wolf nodded, understanding the contingency plan. They all knew the risks. Blackwood had influence in the city, connections that might reach into the courthouse itself. But they'd come too far to turn back now. Sleep came fitfully that night. Jack lay on a real bed for the first time in days and found himself unable to relax his mind, churning through everything that could go wrong. Around midnight, a soft knock came at his door. He opened it to find Ayanna standing in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. "I cannot sleep," she said. "May I sit with you?" They sat together by the small window that looked out over the sleeping city, talking quietly about everything and nothing. About Lily riding north with Red Wing, hopefully safe. About Dakota and Jack's late wife, the ghosts they carried. About what might happen tomorrow, and what might happen after tomorrow if they survived. "When this is over," Ayanna said, as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the mountains. "What will you do?" "Rebuild," Jack said. "The ranch is gone, but the land's still there. Start over, I suppose. Maybe do it right this time." He paused. "I meant what I said before, about asking you something." "And I meant what I said about my answer," Ayanna replied. She took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "But first we must survive tomorrow." "First we survive tomorrow," Jack agreed. The federal courthouse was an imposing building of territorial adobe and imported stone built to project the authority of distant Washington into this frontier territory. Jack and Ayanna climbed the steps at 8:30, wanting to be there when the doors opened. Jack had dressed in his best clothes, trying to look respectable despite the trail dust and hard miles. Ayanna wore a simple dress. Mrs. Chen had provided her long hair braided in the Apache way. They carried the treaty document in a leather satchel, carefully wrapped and protected. Inside, they were directed to the clerk's office, a room lined with law books and filing cabinets. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who'd seen every kind of petitioner and was unimpressed by all of them. "Help you?" he asked. "We're here to file a land treaty," Jack said. "Original document from 1886 signed by Governor Edmund Ross and Chief Dakota of the Apache. We're requesting emergency judicial review and an injunction against federal relocation." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious filing. You'll need authenticated documentation, witness statements, and a filing fee of $20. Jack placed a $20 gold piece on the desk. "We have the original treaty signed and sealed. We have witnesses who can authenticate. And we have evidence of federal crimes committed to suppress this document." The clerk studied them more carefully now, his bureaucratic indifference giving way to something like interest. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into a back room. 10 minutes passed. 15. Jack felt tension building in his chest, the sense that something was wrong. Then the clerk returned, and he wasn't alone. Behind him came a man in a fine suit, perhaps 50 years old, with a marshal's badge on his vest and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "I'm Federal Marshal Edward Kane," the man said. "The clerk tells me you're here to file a treaty from 1886 regarding Apache land rights. That's interesting timing, given that Colonel Harrison Blackwood has been searching for exactly such a document." Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Kane held up a hand. "Easy. I'm not Blackwood's man. In fact, I've been investigating the colonel for the better part of 6 months." Kane gestured to a small office. "Why don't you come with me and tell me your story? All of it." For the next hour, Jack and Ayanna laid out everything. The massacre, the flight, Ben Caldwell's sacrifice, the journey to Santa Fe. Ayanna showed Kane the treaty, explaining its terms and its authenticity. Jack provided his testimony about Blackwood's past crimes in the Philippines, establishing a pattern of behavior. Kane listened without interruption, taking careful notes. When they finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "I believe you," he said simply, "and I can help you, but there's something you need to know. Blackwood has powerful backers, mining interests that reach into the territorial government. If we're going to make this stick, we need more than just the treaty. We need witnesses who can authenticate it, and we need Blackwood himself." "The treaty was witnessed by Governor Ross's brother Samuel," Ayanna said. "He still lives. And Thomas Red Wing Takota's brother was present at the signing." "That's good," Kane said. "But we need Blackwood. We need to catch him in the act of trying to destroy evidence or harm witnesses." He leaned forward. "I have a proposal. Let me use you as bait." The plan was simple and terrifying. Kane would let word leak that the treaty had been filed, that witnesses were being gathered. Blackwood would have to act either to destroy the evidence or silence the witnesses. When he did, Kane's men would be waiting. "It's dangerous," Kane acknowledged, "but it's the only way to get him on charges that will stick. Attempted murder of federal witnesses, destruction of legal documents, conspiracy to defraud. Crimes that can't be swept under the rug by his mining friends." Jack looked at Ayanna, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, but also determination. They'd come this far. They couldn't stop now. "We'll do it," Jack said. The trap was set for that evening. Kane placed Jack and Ayanna in a safe house on the edge of town, a small adobe with a clear view of approaches from all directions. Federal marshals were positioned in nearby buildings, out of sight, but ready to move. The treaty was filed officially, and Kane made sure word reached the right ears that witnesses would testify the next morning. They didn't have to wait long. Just after sunset, a rider approached the safe house, moving cautiously. Jack recognized him immediately. Lieutenant James Carson, the young officer from the cavalry patrol, but now he wore civilian clothes and carried a white flag. Kane allowed him to approach. Carson dismounted, hands visible and empty. "I'm not here with Blackwood," Carson said when they brought him inside. "I'm here to warn you. The colonel knows you're in Santa Fe. He's gathering men planning to attack this location tonight. He's desperate, and desperate men do terrible things." "Why tell us?" Kane asked. "Because I'm done following evil orders," Carson said. "I watched him massacre civilians. I watched him burn villages. I was there when he shot Chief Takota in cold blood." His voice shook. "I have a son back in Ohio. What kind of man do I want him to see when he looks at me? Not the man I've been." Kane studied him. "You willing to testify to all this in federal court?" "Yes, sir, everything. Dates, locations, orders given. I kept a journal, documented it all, in case my conscience ever caught up with my cowardice." Carson pulled a small, leather-bound book from his coat. "It's all here." The attack came 2 hours later. Blackwood led 20 men moving in from 3 directions with military precision, but Kane's marshals were ready. The moment the first shot was fired, federal agents emerged from cover calling for surrender. Blackwood's men, caught between superior forces and facing federal charges rather than local law, threw down their weapons, all except Blackwood himself. The colonel fought his way through the cordon, making for his horse. Jack stepped out to block his path. "End of the line." "Blackwood," Jack said. Blackwood's face twisted with rage. "You should have died at your ranch, Thornton. Should have burned with it." "Maybe. But I didn't. And now you're going to answer for every civilian you've murdered, every treaty you've destroyed, every crime you've committed in the name of greed." Blackwood drew his revolver, but age and anger made him slow. Jack was faster. His shot took Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning the colonel around and sending his gun flying. Federal marshals swarmed in, taking Blackwood into custody as he screamed threats and curses. It was over in minutes. 20 of Blackwood's men arrested the colonel himself in chains, and Carson's testimony ensuring that this time the charges would stick. Kane clapped Jack on the shoulder. "You did good work here, both of you. The treaty will be authenticated tomorrow, and I'll personally see to it that it's enforced." 3 days later, Jack and Ayanna stood in the courtroom as Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence. Samuel Ross, aged but clear-minded, authenticated his brother's signature and recalled the treaty signing in precise detail. Carson testified about the massacre and Blackwood's orders. The treaty map was examined by experts who confirmed its age and authenticity. Judge Harrison's verdict was clear and unequivocal. The Treaty of Blackwater Creek was valid and binding. The Apache people had legal right to 5,000 acres in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Harrison Blackwood would stand trial for murder conspiracy and destruction of federal documents. Reparations would be paid to the survivors. That evening, a rider arrived with news from the north. Thomas Redwing and the decoy party had successfully evaded Blackwood's forces and were riding south to Santa Fe. Lily was safe. The reunion happened on the steps of the courthouse. Ayanna saw her daughter riding beside Redwing and ran to meet them, tears streaming down her face. Lily leaped from the horse into her mother's arms, and the three of them held each other as if they'd never let go. Redwing dismounted more slowly, approaching Jack with careful dignity. Then, to Jack's surprise, the Apache leader smiled and extended his hand in the white man's fashion. "You kept your promise," Redwing said. "You protected my sister. You won justice for our people. You are brother now in truth, as well as words." 2 months later, in the first snow of winter, Jack and Ayanna were married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with territorial law. Lily stood between them, holding both their hands. Thomas Redwing gave the Apache blessing. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears. Even Marshal Kane attended, bringing news that Blackwood had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. They returned to Blackwater Creek in the spring of 1915, finding the land scarred by fire but still beautiful. With help from the Apache families and a handful of Jack's old cavalry friends who'd answered his call, they began to rebuild. Not just a ranch this time, but a community. Apache and white families working side by side, sharing land and water and future. By 1917, 50 people called Blackwater Creek home. A school had been built where children learned both English and Apache. Crops grew in fields tended by mixed crews. Cattle bore brands that combined Apache symbols with American letters. It was a small thing, perhaps, in a world heading toward a great war, but it was real, and it was built on promises kept. The old rocking chair still sat on Jack's porch, weathered but sturdy. And on clear nights when the stars came out, Jack would sit there with Ayanna beside him, watching Lily play with the other children, and he would think about the strange path that had brought him here. From soldier to scout to rancher to fugitive to builder of peace, every step necessary, every choice leading to this moment. And when the stars were very bright, he could almost see them. Ben Caldwell, who'd sacrificed his badge for justice. Dakota, who'd believed peace was possible. All the dead who'd paid the price for other men's greed. Their light shining down, watching over the small piece of earth where their sacrifices had finally borne fruit. October 1961. The present returned like a wave washing over sand, and Jack opened his eyes to find himself back on that same porch 47 years older, with Lily grown and Emma young beside him. "That's how it happened, child," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's how I met your great-grandmother. That's how I learned that the promises we keep matter more than the battles we win." Emma was crying softly, moved by the story. Lily squeezed her father's hand. "Mama lived until 1958, Lily said to Emma. "She and Papa Jack had 43 years together. They built this place into what it is today. 150 people live here now, 3 generations, Apache and white and Mexican, all working together. All because one man kept his promise to a frightened child." Jack looked out over his land, seeing the houses and fields and people moving about their evening tasks. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold. He felt tired, more tired than he'd ever been, but it was a good tired. The tiredness of a life fully lived. "Papa," Lily's voice held a note of concern. Jack smiled. "I'm all right, daughter. Just thinking about your mother, about all of them. Ben and Dakota and Thomas. The price they paid." He looked at Emma. "Remember this, child. Justice isn't something you win once and forget. It's something you build day by day, promise by promise, generation by generation." The dream catcher hung in the window behind them, catching the last light. Jack's eyes grew heavy. He thought he could hear Ayanna's voice on the wind calling him home. Thought he could see Ben Caldwell standing in firelight and Thomas Redwing extending his hand in friendship. His eyes closed, the rocking chair stilled, and Jackson Thornton, who had been a soldier and a scout and a rancher and a fighter for justice, finally rested. Lily held her father's hand as the sun set over Blackwater Creek Ranch, her tears falling silently. But they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of gratitude for a life well lived, for promises kept, for a legacy that would endure. The stars came out one by one, and among them perhaps shone a new light, bright and steady and true.